Well, welcome everyone to our April coffee chat. I'm Laura Knutson Murray. I'm the GIS coordinator and community outreach assistant with IrisBG. With us today is Shanna Jones, our social media and community outreach assistant. The recording, presentation, and any other material will be made available in our knowledge library. As with all of our previous coffee chats, they can be found there under the category articles and presentations. You can also follow IrisBG Coffee Chats and be notified by email anytime something new is published. The idea with these sessions is that we at IrisBG would like to offer you a space where you can connect with your peers and have a chat about IrisBG or any issues that may arise through the work with your collection. We don't have a fixed format for these, so please get in touch with me if you would like to present on a challenge, talk on a topic, or it can be anything, big or small. Hopefully today we'll make a few new connections and together we might become a bit wiser. Save the date for our coffee chat in May. It is Fighting with Nature, Managing Wild Ecosystems in a Botanic Garden. And this will be given by Ella Rockcliffe from Auckland Botanic Gardens. Just note that the time is different. We have to accommodate the New Zealand time zone. So when you register, just make sure you note that it is not at our usual time. Map is an overview of everyone that registered today. Great to see so many from the community represented. And we will launch our regular poll where you rate your experience using IrisBG. What is your level of expertise using IrisBG? Are you a novice, intermediate, an advanced user, or just trying out the trial? It looks like 30% novice, 60% intermediate, and 10% advanced. Thanks, everyone. And now I would like to introduce our speaker. We will be hearing from Michael Eason on Texas oak and rare plant conservation. Michael Eason joined the San Antonio Botanical Garden in 2017 as the Center for Plant Conservation representative, leading South Texas and rare plant conservation efforts. In 2022, he transitioned to a full-time role to expand the garden's conservation and living collections program. As Vice President of Conservation and Collections, he oversees initiatives in seed banking, tissue culture, and native plant propagation, with a focus on the flora of Texas and Southwest US and Northern Mexico. With more than 2 decades of experience as a conservation biologist, Michael Eason previously managed conservation and field survey programs at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center and led native plant consulting projects through his firm, Texas Flora. He's the author of Wildflowers of Texas and is currently developing additional works on Texas flora. Michael serves on the board of directors for the International Oak Society and for the conservation community of the American Public Gardens, and as a state botanist for the Native Plant Society of Texas. So without further ado, let's welcome Michael.
Howdy. Thanks everyone for showing up today and for the folks at Iris for inviting me here. Thanks for having me. And as mentioned, Michael Eason, the Vice President of Conservation and Collections at the San Antonio Botanical Garden. I've been there since 2017. About half of that was part-time. And then, as mentioned, in 2022, I moved into a full-time role and has sort of seen the evolution of the conservation department there. And I'll get into that. So let's just get started. So first, a little brief history of the garden. Idea of the garden sort of first popped up in the 1960s in San Antonio amongst a group of people. And it wasn't until, I believe, the 70s, some funding was raised. And then in 1980, it was officially opened early May of 1980. A few years after that, the conservatories were built, and they're sort of iconic now, but at the time it was a little bit of drama going on at the garden. Apparently people just could not fathom, these glass houses by Emilio Ambaz there in San Antonio at the garden. But now, looking back, I don't think anyone could imagine the garden without those. So those conservatories were opened in the late 80s, and 2017, 2016, there was impeded growth. I'm not sure the best way to state that, but it was more of just sort of status quo. There wasn't a lot of programming. There was no ambition to spread much beyond San Antonio. And then in 2015s or so, there was some fundraising that started to happen with sort of an expansion. We bought about 7.5 more acres. We saw phase 1 and phase 2 capital projects, which then that put in our family adventure garden, classrooms, offices, admin space, and our Betty Kelso Center. which houses about up to about 300 people for events and stuff. And it was about that time. So I was brought on in 2017, and it was things were slowly moving, and I was just there to kind of keep things at some point just alive. And then around 2020, when we hired our new executive director, Sabina Carr, that's when I recognized that things were changing quickly and for the better there at the garden. And I wanted to be involved. At that point, there was one conservation program, and that was the Center for Plant Conservation. It was established at the garden in 1985. So this is our longest running program. And there was a focus on native plants in the garden for the longest time. And like I said, when I came in 2017, it was just maintaining those. In 2020, when I saw what was happening at the garden, like I knew I needed to be involved. I wanted to be involved. And it was basically the rebuilding of a conservation program. And so I lobbied a little bit. I let everyone know who needed to know that I would be willing to move from West Texas, the mountains of West Texas, population 5,000, Alpine, Texas, back to San Antonio or to San Antonio to a larger city. And I did that because I knew from sort of past experience, people would just maybe assume that I was totally happy out here in West Texas and wouldn't want to leave. But I knew I could do more change affiliated with the Botanic Garden than I could with my sort of current role being independent out here in West Texas. So what happened when I started there? So, and what we're sort of going to go over. So when I first started, there was just the original sort of assessment and then the goals. And this is again, 21, 22, when I came full time, sort of assessing what we had as far as our collections, what was needed, and some goals that we could reach in the next few years. We're going to talk a little about some programs, staff and volunteers that were needed. And at some point, I knew that we needed a database and some sort of tracking mechanism for all these plants. And with all of that, there are absolutely zero protocols, procedures, or policies that were in place at the garden concerning conservation, living collections policies, stuff like that. So those are the topics we're going to talk about. So that first thing, I called it the big purge. We had a fair collection of rare plants at the garden when I started. However, the vast majority of those were non-provenance plants. And when it comes to conservation, as we all know, like having provenance collections is the key. The plants are pretty much worthless without data behind them. And we just had to get rid of all these that were taking up space. They were beautiful. Nobody knew where they came from. There were rumors that they came from some person in South Texas or someone donated it. And we had a really nice collection of plants. But again, none of them had any data with them. And at that time, we had about 13 taxa that were under the CPC umbrella. And that was one of the things I saw, that there was definitely room for growth there for the garden. And so we made that switch, or I made that switch to start bringing in those provenance collections. And we would do that, to feed the seed bank that we had established, and also that would feed our living collection. Another thing that was duly noted is we had zero equipment when it came to conservation. I remember walking into one of the greenhouses where everything sat, all the rare plants, and they were just on wooden pallets on the ground. There was no tables, and the conservation plants got moved from greenhouse to greenhouse because while they were somewhat important to the garden, they weren't a collection that they really championed. We had no field gear. I was using my own GPS, my own vehicle for the longest time, my own shovels, just sort of everything, coolers. And it had all of this equipment from my previous field work that it was very easy to sort of seamlessly kind of move in and just use my own stuff. But I knew that we had to replace that at one point. Staff. So I was the only staff member. I started off as sort of an associate director of conservation and then moved up to director, then eventually vice president. That was really just a title change. But I knew that eventually we would need more staff as the collection grew, mainly with the propagation and plant care. So as we're propagating these plants, we needed someone there on site to take care of those. Eventually, we would need a data person that would track all of this information and that database. Ideally, I was hoping to find somebody that could assist with field collections, because I knew that as the program grew and my position there changed over time, I'd be spending less and less time in the field. And eventually, there would be a need for sort of more of the project manager or the director position to oversee some of these. One of the things that we looked at, or I looked at, was establishing these clear collection targets. I'd mentioned that we had 13 species under the CPC umbrella. So those were ones that I needed to revisit, try to recollect, and sort of start with those 13 plants. But beyond that, there were other collections that we needed to really look at. And these were sort of the non-at-risk or rare plants that we have here in Texas. So the idea was to eventually establish some goals surrounding those collections, whatever those might be. And I'll talk about those later. And of course, during all of this, sort of reestablishing partnerships that I'd had previously when I was at the Wildflower Center. I had not been to a CPC conference in well over a decade. And I'd still kept in touch with a lot of my friends that worked in botanic gardens, but finding new people, new partnerships, new gardens, collaborating on different projects that would sort of come our way. And the final thing that I knew that we needed to do was sort of establish some sort of conservation volunteer program where we could have the volunteers come in and assist there at the garden and in the field whenever that situation arose. So in working with Andrew LeBay, who at the time was our director of horticulture. He is now our chief mission officer. But we had talked about how our philosophy there at the garden, like moving forward, and we had visited a few gardens and talked to people, and we had heard that horticulture and conservation often were very separate in other gardens. And so we wanted to keep that siloing to a minimum, and we wanted the two departments to be integrated to where we're working together. We have a shared space back there, whether that's assistance in watering or plant care, or in the development of bringing in plants. And we'll get into sort of bringing those provenance versus non-provenance plants together. But we wanted to make sure that as the garden grew and these two departments grew, that there wasn't this hard line of separation between the two. And I'm not sure if anyone's ever visited any of those gardens, but we had heard in visiting gardens, and Andrew being in horticulture and me being in conservation, you would get versa from conservation. It's like, well, that's the Hort's deal. We don't even bother with that. We wanted to make sure that didn't happen moving forward with ours. We recognized that the garden was both going to be a display garden. So we'll have those annual big shows that happen every once in a while, or 3 changeouts per year. But there was also room for those provenance collections to be mixed in. And so working with Andrew, oftentimes whenever we would have a new garden design come through and the plant selection was put in place, we would review all of those and see what sort of substitutions we could make that sort of aligned with some of our collections that we were going after. One of the biggest goals was to bring diversity back to the garden. Over the years, as plants would die in the garden, they would just simply be replaced with something that was very commonly found. So we lost a high percentage of our diversity, mainly because there wasn't somebody going out into the field and doing these collections for a good 10 or 15 years. And so we knew we needed to bring that back. One of the things in the very beginning was having, and I'm still a little bit surprised that this happened during that first year of my full-time employment there, was we had a dedicated travel and expense budget for conservation that was based on if we're going to build our collections, that I needed to be in the field a lot. And when I say a lot, 120, 150 days a year. So there was a lot of travel there in the beginning, 2022-ish. But with all of that, it was sort of this slow, intentional, and dedicated sort of growth of the conservation department. I knew that we wouldn't be able to do everything at once. And so it was like, okay, well, let's buy a scale this year. Let's buy a seed column cleaner this year. Let's buy whatever it may be. It took, I believe, 2 years to finally get a vehicle. And, I waited until the garden was in a good place to where they could afford that $50,000 purchase for conservation. So getting back to Center for Plant Conservation, this is our longest running program. When I took it over, I mentioned we had 13 species under our umbrella. I think we're up to 22 now. There at the beginning, we just did not obviously have the staff to do research or reintroductions or spend a lot of time on any 1 or 2 species. So my goal was to go back and do the monitoring of those 13 species, collect what I can, bring that back for propagation and seed banking. We sort of focused on what was obtainable So we didn't try to do any sort of overreach. I knew that the goals that I'd set for myself and the garden were, I'm not going to say easy because you had to do the work, but they were obtainable. I could reach out to friends, old landowners, get access to some of these properties, make these collections. One of the issues that we have at the garden, and still to a small amount, is plant mortality. With a lot of these rare plants, it takes a special bit of knowledge in order to keep them alive. It's not as if we're just growing pansies or tulips or anything like that. So we did have a lot of plant mortality, especially with some of our Asclepias that we brought in. So each year, instead of like trying to go after each 13, we would have sort of our primary targets that I would go after. The very first year was this Asclepias prostrata. So it's a prostrate milkweed from South Texas, currently listed endangered. And, I visited known locations. I had access. So I made it somewhat easy on myself, and so did the weather. I think the first year we had a fairly decent seed collection. The second year there was drought and everything was aborted. But we also had secondary targets for each year, and those are the more sort of opportunistic. So when I was out working with other institutions or on other projects or visiting other properties, if I happened to come across some of these other plants, I'd be aware of those and bring them in. And so the goal that we had set back then was to basically collect 25% of the at-risk taxa for Texas, which ended up being about 115 taxa. So some of those were donations from other gardens, but many of those were just seeds that we had gone out and collected from the various sites. And through my years of experience, especially out here in West and Central Texas, I knew where most of these plants were. So it was just a matter of getting out and collecting those. And then, of course, that was over about 3 years when we did that. And during that time, that's when we increased our umbrella species there at CPC from 13 to about 22. I would say in conjunction with the CPC work that we were doing, one thing that I wanted to do was establish a seed bank. And the reason being is because you don't need special knowledge in order to have a seed bank. There's some protocols that you need to follow, but for seed collection, it's pretty straightforward. You need permissions, you need special tools or equipment in order to do this. We had a Texas focus in the beginning. The idea was to collect multiple collections per taxa and not just one collection per species or taxa throughout the state. So widespread species may have 5 or 7 collections currently. So this is, again, starting in about 2021-ish, somewhere in there. So in the past few years, we're over 750 collections. And this is sort of a slow build. First, it was the purchase of a refrigerator. Then it was a purchase of a freezer. And then we had a dry cabinet that I'd purchased. So all of these little steps in order to build up to this occurred. Other things that we looked at were our special collections, oaks, the Fabiaceae, woody plants in general, woody native plants, I should state, milkweeds of Texas in the Southwest, and of course our rare plants and then native plants. I'll talk about some of those later. And other like sort of smaller collections that we've had over the years or we've gone after were sort of the aquatics of Texas. And I did that because a friend of mine needed some assistance getting access to some properties in West Texas. And so we kind of joined forces with him in redocumenting and doing some of the collections of some of these sort of rarer West Texas aquatics. In conjunction with that, we were also collecting ferns. And then most recently, we've had some volunteers from the San Antonio Cactus and Xerophyte Society who wanted to get involved with the garden. So now we're building up a small cacti and succulent collection for Texas. I've always avoided this in the past, mainly because we just did not have the bandwidth at the garden to really focus on the cactus because they need a bit of special care. That might sound silly coming from Texas, but when these plants are in greenhouses, they really don't like it. So we need someone there on a regular basis that can monitor the health of these plants and sort of advise us on what needs to do. But again, the overall goal was to increase that diversity in the garden. So a little side note on this. And I can't see anybody's faces or anything. So this is a gentleman by the name of Nikolai Vavilov. I'm not sure if anyone's ever heard of him. Hopefully some of y'all have. He established the first seed bank in Russia, and that was the Institute of Plant and Technology and Industry. He has a fascinating story, as well as the workers that were in that seed bank, that Institute of Plant Technology. If anyone is interested, I highly, highly recommend reading this book. It's called The Forbidden Garden, and it's the story of the siege of Leningrad and the botanists that were tasked with protecting the seed bank. that was there during that time. So back to oaks, our programs. So one of the first things that happened with us, a good friend of mine, Adam Black, had asked me to help out with an oak project out here in West Texas. And I remember at the time, I was just like, Adam, I just don't have time. I was working part-time for the garden at that point, but he enlisted me, and I, started joining some of the field work that was going on out here in West Texas. And at the same time, he had asked me to sort of co-lead a tour for the International Oak Society, which their conference was up in Las Cruces. And reluctantly, I agreed to do that. And since then, and this is going to be sort of a plug for the International Oak Society, highly, highly recommend joining this group. It's a fantastic group of sort of enthusiasts, academics, and people that really just love trees and oaks. Great group of people. But so I ended up obviously joining them later on after that conference. I was just so enamored with everything. But the GCCO, the Global Conservation Consortium for Oak, they were working on these projects here in West Texas and the Southwest and Northern Mexico. And that's what really sort of spurred hey, maybe we should go after an oak collection for West Texas, or the Southwest U.S. rather. So everything from Western Texas all the way to California. We do have some collections from Mexico that we also had in our collection previously. Those are non-provenance plants, but we thought, well, if we have the opportunity to collect in Mexico, we should sort of add that to our list of species or taxa that we want to include in our collection. We did recognize that during this, we'd probably obtain or have access to some other non-US sort of old world specimens. And if that was the case, we wanted to have some of these extra plants. Would anybody like one? And of course, we signed up for one, and it arrived in a box, and it looked like it had seen better days, but now that's sort of in our back of house, so it's waiting to be planted. Currently, we have over 130 taxa of oaks. The vast majority of those are southwestern. So like I'd mentioned, those sort of West Texas or central to West Texas all the way to California. I think we have every taxa that occurs in West Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, aside from, I believe there's 2 or 3 that we're missing. One of them is iffy whether or not it actually occurs in the United States. We have I'm going to say about 30 taxa from Mexico. Most of that is northern Mexico. I was just down last year with the International Oak Society. They had their conference in Oaxaca. And so I was able to take that opportunity to do some collecting along with a whole bunch of other folks. So we added about another 15 or so taxa. We do have other species from southeastern US, a bit from the Northeast, and a handful. I think we have 2 from Europe, and then 1 species from Japan. But the focus again was that West Texas all the way to California. And one of the reasons, or when we look at these collections, so like the Quercus hinklei up there, that's a rare plant here in Texas. So that sort of ticks off our rare plant collection that we have. It's a woody plant, so it ticks off our woody plant collection. It's an oak, and so it sort of ticks off that one. And then it also ticks the box for a native plant. So many times we're very intentional on the plants that when we're targeting those plants for collection, that it's not just a one-off. It's not just going to be like one plant that's interesting to have in the garden. It applies to many different collections that we have. So over time, each one of those is building. So that Oaks of the Southwest project that Adam got me involved with, you may have heard about it. That the big sort of superstar behind that was the Quercus tardifolia. It was presumed extinct at the time, and we had arranged a week in Big Bend National Park in the upper elevations with a team of 9 folks from different organizations, and we basically surveyed the upper reaches of Big Bend National Park for 3 or 4 days. I think it was on day 3 that we actually found this tree, so it sort of made headlines around the world. It was a pretty interesting story that people, because people can relate to oaks. They're not going to relate to some really small plant that occurs on one cliff face out here in West Texas. So that was a huge lift for the garden, just being involved in that project. Spoiler alert, after some genetic work was done, it was determined that it is a hybrid between Quercus hypoleucoides and Quercus gravesii. The next question is where does the hypoleucoides come from? Because hypoleucoides is not known from Big Bend National Park. So that sort of spurs some more research, some more expeditions, some more field work in that area. So that was a huge thing that I reluctantly agreed to do. So in retrospect, that was pretty nice. Another one of our programs or collections that we're focusing on is the Fabiaceae. Again, there's those boxes we get to tick off, whether it's rare, native, or woody. For almost every collection that we make, the intention is to have seeds in the seed bank. Now, that's for the orthodox seed, of course, but those plants in some cases, so like that Sessalpinia phylanthoides, that's a very rare Fabiaceae that we have in South Texas. So that's goes into our rare plant collection. We don't sell that. We will share it with other botanic gardens. But the mimosa there, that one, when I make a collection of that, we put a portion in the seed bank. We propagate some of that for our living collection. And then whatever we have left over, that will either be donated to other botanic gardens or go into our plant sale. And we do that with a lot of those plants. The only plants that we don't put in our plant sale are listed species, rare plants that are collected from the wild. That said, the Bauhinia lunarides down there is listed as a rare plant in Texas. We've had permits to collect that plant from private land here in the state of Texas. We have made those collections. We have propagated that seed. Those will not go into the plant sale. But if you happen to show up at the garden and there's Bauhinia in the plant sale, those Bauhinias are common in a trade. So it's an interesting little thing that goes on here in Texas. We have some of our rare plants that are very, very common in trade, Bauhinia being one of them. So another interesting project that just popped up. This is an endangered species of cactus, Echinocereus Reichenbachii variety albertii, commonly known as the black lace cactus. I had a colleague reach out to me. He was working on a mine site down south of town, south of San Antonio, about an hour, and he needed some assistance with this project he was working on. And it was this massive sort of rescue effort, black lace cactus. The population was known to have about 9,000 roughly individuals in it. And the goal was to rescue as many as possible, bring those back to the garden. We put them in these sort of A5 containers. They're currently outside now. That photo was taken inside the greenhouse just after we potted them up. So we rescued as many as we possibly could. I think we're up to about 3,400 now. Pot them up at the garden, put them outside, let them produce seed, collect that seed, propagate that seed with the eventual idea of returning well over 10,000 plants to the wild. We'll make one last collection effort here very soon in late April, early May to do seed collection from what remains of the wild plants and do one last sort of collection effort on those live plants that are still remaining, the individuals out in the garden. I'm hoping to collect about another 500 or so. The thing is, with this, when this first came up, it was proposed as, oh, we just want 1,000 plants. And I was like, oh, that's completely doable. And then when these numbers increased, I realized like there's no way that we're going to be able to take on this project at the garden by ourselves. And so we had some volunteers, and that is the San Antonio Cactus and Xerophyte Society that really got into this project, and they wanted to help so much. They wanted to help with the rescue effort. They wanted to help with the plant care at the garden, the seeding or the collection of seeds, the propagation. So we've sort of brought them into the garden to assist with all of this additional work that we have. So volunteers. So from the beginning there, I recognized that we did need volunteers to assist. I think we just started off with Tuesday volunteers from 9 to 12. And then over time that has increased. And then we have basically Tuesdays and Thursdays and then occasional Saturdays. The program's evolved over time. In the beginning, it was mainly about plant care, maintenance, and propagation. Now we have volunteers that assist with seed cleaning and data and sign management in conjunction with that propagation and maintenance. There's different photos here that sort of top left are all the cactus volunteers planting out the black lace cactus. That bottom right photo, that is some volunteers that are help cleaning seed. And then that bottom left photo is the black lace cactus rescue effort that we had. And I think we had about 22 people show up that day. So we have these special projects that occur throughout the year that we can enlist like larger groups of volunteers. For the seed cleaning on that trees project that we're working on, I'll talk a little bit about that later. I think one of those days we had over 50 volunteers show up to assist cleaning seeds. And then staff over the years. I think I mentioned this earlier, but initially that first person that we needed to hire was somebody that had propagation and plant care experience. So someone that can actually take care of our collections, especially if I'm going to be gone for, 10 days at a time, we need somebody back there that really knows what's going on. We eventually hired that person. We also hired a part-time person out here in West Texas to assist with field work. Most recently, we hired Matt Welch, he's our new director of conservation, and he's overseeing one of our major projects. That's him behind the Tardifolia. And a few years ago, we did hire somebody to manage our data. And that was about the time, or right at the time, we had purchased IrisBG. And that's Corey Fauché. She was the one that came in as an intern. We had some funding from the Native Plant Society of Texas. She came in after 6 months, transferred into a part-time position, and then eventually a full-time position. With our IrisBG, our main focus there in the beginning was documenting all the woody plants we had in the garden, thinking like those would be the ones that are going to be around the longest. So we started off with that. And very quickly, we realized we needed an embosser to tag everything. So that was another big purchase we had to make. Very quickly, we realized that we needed a much better GPS system. So we purchased the Bad Elf system, which was sort of the cheaper version of the Trimble. And during all of this, we're learning like the best practices, what to purchase for the stakes, how to attach many of these signs, sort of just you can just imagine the myriad of sort of minute little problems that pop up almost daily while we're trying to figure out some of these things. Our stakes that we ended up with are actually stakes that are used to hold landscape fabric down. To me, those seem like to be some of the toughest versus the smaller aluminum pins that you can get for some of those embossed labels. Our first wild accession plant, Quercus hinklei, which was a collection that I made out in West Texas. And you can see that was the entry date, I believe. Yeah. And it was collected in 2023, I believe. So that was our first wild collection, accession plant in the garden in well over 15 years. And so that one is currently in our rare and endangered garden. And on top of all of that, as mentioned, for the new department, we just didn't have anything in place. So we're having to develop all of these as we move forward. Biggest policy that we had to create, and that was in conjunction with Andrew LeBay and myself, was our living collections policy. And that sort of set the standard on our special collections, the collections that we have in the garden, what we're bringing in, how to manage the non-natives and the invasive species. We took it under our wing to really cast a broad net when it came to invasive species. And so we have numerous no-grow taxa for our garden unless they're for research. There were other things, we call them spontaneous flora. Those are plants that were just allowed to grow. So these would have been native plants like hackberry or cedar elm, but they were just allowed to do their thing in various areas of the garden because it looked native. But over time, many of these fast-growing natives, they sort of outgrew their space and then shaded out some of the wanted natives or some of our collections. And the wanted plants ended up dying. And those spontaneous flora, those hackberries and cedar elms often just took over areas. And so we developed this policy of like clearing out many of these throughout the garden, which then opens up space for some of our provenance collections. So we had to develop numerous other things, field collection protocols, deciding, what are we accessioning when it comes to the garden. So we've had many meetings about that. There's things that there was a culture shift we had to deal with because that's in the past, most of the gardeners were just given plants and as they go plant these things and they would do that. And there was no record keeping or documentation behind that. And so now we're trying to establish, at least with those accession plants, like what is documented and how that is documented. And again, this is not just a conservation sort of culture that we're developing. It's more of that garden-wide culture that you're having to sort of absorb and change. So today we have just 4.5 staff. So myself, as the VP, we have a director, we have our conservation manager that oversees all the propagation, Corey, who does all of our technical, sort of the IrisBG, the embossing, the signs, and she assists with other things. And we have our part-time person out here in West Texas. The only reason why I'm showing this photo is because there's a white truck in it. And that's a photo I just took last week when I was in the Guadalupes. And the truck is a major purchase for us, and it allows us to do so much work throughout the state of Texas. We're not relying on personal vehicles or rentals or anything like that. So it was And it was years and years in coming, having to work that into the budget. We have our foundational projects, the seed bank, Center for Plant Conservation, and our first sort of premier collection, which will be oaks. We have numerous sort of local, regional, national projects and collaborations throughout the United States. And now that I'm heavily involved with the International Oak Society, sort of international projects and collaborations. The department itself is fairly solid. We haven't seen sort of insane growth where all of a sudden we're scrambling to find funding for all these positions. It's been very intentional in seeing that growth happen year by year instead of trying to hire everybody that first year. The department will be growing. We have plans in the near future to hire some more people. We're heavily involved with the International Oak Society, the Global Conservation Consortium for Oak and Ash now, a new one that was just formed recently by Adam Black out of Bartlett. I'm involved with APGA, Native Plant Society, and I'm encouraging my staff and other staff there at the garden to be involved with some of these organizations. So our new hire, he'll most likely get heavily involved with the Society for Ecological Restoration. And it's really to let them, kind of follow what path makes sense for whatever they're working on, and encouraging people to continue to educate themselves and go to school. So that's sort of that solid foundation that we have. And this was several years in building from 2022 roughly up to 2025. And so last year, Andrew LeBay, after the flooding that happened here in Central Texas, had this idea of what could the garden do to assist the Guadalupe. And that was basically replant 50,000 trees. And we knew at the time, had this happened 2 years previously, I don't think we could have done this. But because we had already sort of set ourselves up and we had staff that was trained and kind of knew procedures and protocols when it came around seed collection and working with landowners in our volunteer program, et cetera, effort to plant 50,000 trees along the Guadalupe River with a hyper-local approach to collections. What does that mean? We're collecting everything from the watershed of the Guadalupe River. Initially, it's a 3-year project, but we're looking at extending that up to 10 years. It's scalable, so it can continue going, or if we need to shift and go to another watershed, we can very easily do that. It's heavily volunteer-based and partner-based, so we only have a few staff that are in key positions that are working with volunteers and other partners. For seed collection, if you're not from Texas, there was one public land we were able to collect from, and that was all the way down at Guadalupe River State Park. All other collections came from private property, so we had to get access to all of those private landowners. And so, like I said, we had that staff and expertise to be able to take that on. 2 years ago, I don't think we could have done this. Now, being where the garden is now and the conservation department is now, we were able to take this on confidently and knowing that it would be successful. We didn't want to take this project on and have it fail. In the future, what are we looking at? Part of our new master plan for the garden in the next 10 years, we are redoing our entire greenhouse campus. So we're looking at installing or building a science and conservation and education building. That ground floor will house a seed lab. I think we've about 1,300 square feet, 400 square foot high capacity seed vault that will sort of service all of the Southwest. We're also looking at putting in tissue culture lab. That actually is moving a little bit faster. We've identified a place in one of our conservatories where we may be able to put this in. In conjunction with all of that, having the conservation department sort of own greenhouse and head house adjacent to some seed amplification plots so we can increase some of our rare plant seeds, establishing research sites throughout the state of Texas. And most recently, and this came out about with the trees initiative I just mentioned, is establishing a new sort of conservation restoration program. And that is this idea of restoration based in conservation best practices. So that seed collection aspect when it comes to conservation, long-term conservation, applying that to restoration practices. The person that we just hired has extensive experience in port, in propagation with large numbers of plants. And so establishing those sort of port practices as well with that conservation restoration aspect. So one thing that we always get complimented on or said about the garden is that we're scrappy and innovative. We try to make things work out. We don't have all the resources. Our greenhouses in the back are 30 plus years old. As mentioned, many of those first years, I was using my own equipment. We just kind of figure things out as we go and we make things work. And this is our director, or now our new chief mission officer, Andrew LeBay, who one afternoon while it was late, about 4:30 or so, I was getting ready to leave. And I see him pushing this wheelbarrow and he's like, "What are you doing?" He goes, "Well, we just, did got that big plant donation from that garden up in Austin. And so I'm going to just go pot them up real quick." And it's that sort of attitude, I think, that is across our garden that's allowed sort of this growth to occur. Andrew could have very easily just had somebody do all that work the next day, but he just knew it's just like, they're going to be busy the following day. Let me just stay behind for another hour or two and just get it done before tomorrow. So that will be it. So I'm open for questions, and thanks again for everyone for showing up today.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was really inspirational how much you've done in a few short years. I know it sounds like a long time for you, maybe, but it really is just a few short years to build what you've built. It's fantastic.
Thank you.